All right. This next article we got is for those tax nerds out there. Ty, you're included in that. Anyway, this is from Accountancy Age, or excuse me, from Accountant. What is this? Accounting Today. Sorry. And the title of the article is kind of misleading. It's which IRS division is conducting your R&D credit exam? The answer is crucial. Now, the article really goes into the history of the R&D credit and who examines it and what they do and how that is. What I found interesting, where I guess, and I didn't know this, and so for our viewers that don't, there's four principal examination divisions, audit divisions within the IRS, and they're the wage and investment, and that's responsible for personal tax returns. So if you get your personal tax return audited, that's who does it. There's another one, tax exempt and government entities, which is responsible for auditing tax exempt and government entities. Then there's large business international and small business and self-employed. So if you have a business and you're claiming the research function, the last two, the large business and international, LBI, and small business and self-employed are the ones that would be auditing you. The article goes into depth about what those are, or how those limits are done, and kind of the history behind each of them. We won't go into it because I don't think it's that much. The thing to know is if you have assets greater than 10 million, you're large business and international, and anything below that is considered small business or self-employed. I think the real crux of the article, and the reason why I picked it, is the last paragraph in the article where he summarizes. And I'll quote him here. If you filed research credit is selected for audit, the size of your company will likely determine the experience level of your assigned examiner. Regardless of which division your company falls under, your examination will be comprehensive. So be prepared with sound explanations and documentation, and seek advice from a trusted practitioner. And that's Mark Bodenstab. So the reason why I bring it up is I thought maybe I have no idea of what goes into the documentation or calculation of the R&D credit. So I thought maybe Ty could give us an explanation of that, because I know he has a little bit of experience in that field. But also too, if at all you think this is something that a small business could go at it themselves, and is his advice sage in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think research credit analysis and documentation, sometimes referred to as research credit studies, is its own little cottage industry these days. So there's entire firms that they specialize in just that, or we see kind of these accounting tax credit firms that maybe specialize in that, along with a few other tax specialties like cost segregation studies or other special tax incentives, and that's all they do. They specialize in that all day long. And I think that if you're claiming really large credits, and you're in a complicated industry, or your company is particularly complicated, I think working with specialists like that is probably a good idea in terms of determining your credit, and also mostly the documentation side of it. We do work for our clients where we help them line out their documentation and calculate their credits for their tax preparers. We do that in a very narrow, in a very narrow industry spectrum. We do that with smaller software companies and digital agencies, because we have a lot of knowledge about their operations and how they otherwise operate from our CFO advisory practice, that it lends itself to us understanding kind of the data flow that would be necessary for the research credit analysis and documentation. And so, I mean, and that's the thing, is that most of the work involved there that we're talking about is really the documentation side, because the calculation itself, of course, there's a calculation to do, and you want to know what the credit is, and there are some options, but actually there's not that many options in the calculation. So you could literally do all of the options on the same spreadsheet, and kind of do scenario analysis of determining what credit you want to go from there usually. So it's not and not only that, but your regular accounting firm who does your tax return, even if they don't specialize in R&D credits or research credits, they've got tax software that can pump through the calculation for you if the raw data is there, right? So it's really the real issue is the documentation of how are you qualifying your research activities? How are you qualifying your qualified research expenditures? How are you calculating those expenditures? And what are your data systems that support those and document those? That's where all the work is. And yeah, I mean, if you're claiming a research credit, you definitely need to do that work. I think if you are a smaller business claiming a very modest credit, you could be trained on how to maintain that documentation, and you could conceivably do it yourself. Although a lot of the client companies that I've worked with, even though I think they probably could do it themselves, have said, "Nah, we don't want to." We want to have that kind of second set of eyes to make sure that what we're documenting would make some sense to somebody else, so that if we ever have to explain it to the IRS, we've at least tried to explain it once to some other accountant too. So I think that's a good exercise.
And that goes along really well with what AJ was saying, that I think is a really good point to consider here, which is that the audit, once you are selected for this, that the audit that they do is comprehensive. And so it's important to kind of think about audit risk when you take your tax positions. And so you might look and say, okay, I feel I know the ins and outs of this credit, but I don't know whether or not I have the documentation well enough to be able to articulate that to someone else. And I don't maybe feel as confident in my other positions that I would then want to risk those being put to more scrutiny, all because I tried to guess and do this one calculation myself. And so I think it's important to take kind of a holistic approach to your audit risk when taking any position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the more complicated your business is, the more and the larger your credit is, the size of credit doesn't theoretically, like the size of credit itself is not directly related conceptually to how much documentation you should need or not. But in practice, it's an indicator of the complexity of what's going into the overall calculation. In my experience, large credits have more complexity involved. Small credits have less complexity involved. And so if you're trying to claim a fairly large credit, that probably means investing more in your documentation is worthwhile. If you're claiming a smaller credit, it may be easier to with some advice on the front end to kind of do some of it yourself.